Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. We're going to be discussing the various bird wyverns that have appeared throughout the Monster Hunter series, specifically the ones that are leaders of their respective packs. Most of them have only had a couple of appearances, and even then they haven't changed much, but there are a lot of them, and so I think discussing them all would make for a very interesting video. The first bird wyvern in the series is Velocidrome, a blue raptor with dark stripes and a red crest. He is usually accompanied by smaller monsters known as Velociprey, and they generally live in forest and jungle regions. They were both introduced in the first game, with Velocidrome being the first monster you ever fight. The game has two other raptor-like bird wyverns, the Gendrome and Iodrome. All three have similar movesets, with some small but key differences. Velocidrome has very few attacks. He can swipe in front of him, bite, or perform a jumping attack. He mainly repositions by hopping to the left and right and running forward. This already makes him a very basic monster, but he also cannot enrage. Gendrome is very much the same, although his minions are known as Genprey. The key difference here is that the Gendrome can paralyze you, and that he tends to live in the desert. Iodrome's minions are called Ioprey. He's arguably the hardest raptor out of the main three, since not only does he have more health, he has poisonous spit he can use as a projectile. Now I say the main three, which isn't strictly true, because Monster Hunter Freedom 2 introduced the Gaiadrome, and the small monster Gaiaprey. Again, he's identical to the others, but he's more similar to Iodrome in that he has a projectile, this one causing the snowman status. Gaiadrome most likely exists because the Arctic Ridge was the first locale in Freedom 2, and the developers wanted a new tutorial monster for players to fight there. It is worth mentioning that none of these raptors appeared in G-Rank for the first or second generation, and they skipped the third generation entirely. Monster Hunter Tri introduced two entirely new raptors, the Great Jaggi and the Great Baggi. These bird wyverns have a different body structure, having a lot more mass. Like the dromes that preceded them, they also have younger minions. The Great Jaggi is capable of biting forward, he can swing his tail around while shifting his body, and perform a hip check too. The Great Baggi does this as well, although he can also spit projectiles that cause hunters to fall asleep, allowing him a free attack opportunity. While Jaggi lives in a deserted island and sandy plains, Baggi lives in the tundra. Portable Third brought them back, but also introduced the Great Rogi, who lives in the flooded forest and volcano. Rogi has all the same attacks, but he can also spit a cloud of poison that lingers in the air. The Great Raptors, also known as the Dog Wyverns, all have the ability to call for their minions, which will have them arrive in the area to assist them. Velocidrome is shown to be doing this in a cutscene in the older games, but he and the drones cannot do it in gameplay. In G-Rank, they all move twice as fast. The Great Rogi can expel a bigger cloud of poison gas, while the Great Baggi can spit sleep juice while jumping backwards. Before we go any further, I would like to discuss the naming conventions of these monsters. You might be wondering why the early raptors have the word Drome at the end of their name, while the new ones have Great. Even in games like World you have the Great Jagras, or Gyros, and the name Drome hasn't been given to a monster since the second generation. In Japan, the Velociprey are referred to as Ranposu, while the Velocidrome is Dosu Ranposu. The Gaiaprey are Gaianosu, while the Gaiadrome is Dosu Gaianosu. These are their original names, with the Dosu signifying that they are the larger ones. Even other monsters with the word Drome have this naming convention in Japanese, such as the Dosu Garyosu and Garyosu, being the Cephadrome and Cephalos respectively. The thing is, this also extends to the great monsters. In Japan, Jaggi are called Jaggi, while the great is called Dosu Jaggi. The Rogi is Furogi, and the great is Dosu Furogi. And yes, this also applies to the wild monsters too. Jagras is Jagurasu, while the great is Dos Jagurasu. So for all intents and purposes, the great monsters should be called Drome, Jaggydrome, Baggydrome, Jagrasdrome, but they're not. And as far as I can tell, the only reason is that the localization team for Monster Hunter Tri simply decided to give these new wyverns a different moniker, and the name stuck for future generations. The point is, these types of monsters used to be called Drome, and from the third generation onwards, all new monsters like this are called the Great. It ultimately doesn't really matter, but is worth bringing up. When the three original bird wyverns showed up in Monster Hunter 4, they kept their original names. That being said, they did get some cool new additions. They can now become enraged, and they can limp back to their nests. They can summon their minions like the Dog Wyverns, they have new pin attacks, and they all have breakable crests. Moveset wise, their attacks flow together much faster and are much more accurate. Iodrome's poison got a huge upgrade in that it leaves huge puddles on the ground. He and Velocidrome are available to fight in G rank and are much faster there, although Gendrome got the short end of the stick and is limited to low and high rank. Velocidrome is also Guild Quest and Everwood exclusive. 2 of the Dog Wyverns, Baggy and Roggy, did not return for 4, but the Jaggy did, as the first monster players encounter in the game. He gets no new additions and is not available in G rank. He is also one of the few monsters to never become frenzied. Moving on to generations, all of the first generation raptors made a return, while the Great Jaggy was absent, making Monster Hunter 4 his last appearance. This game introduced a brand new dog wyvern, the Great Macaw, along with several smaller macaws. Great Macaw is probably the most unique bird wyvern so far. He attacks primarily by hopping on his tail like a pogo stick and kicking, either stationary or launching himself across the area. He can readjust himself to aim at you too. Very occasionally, he will double it up with another attack. He can swipe twice while dashing forward, as well as perform 2 smaller kicking volleys, and will smack his tail on the ground repeatedly. If you smack the macaw while he's launching towards you, he gets knocked onto the ground for a while. G-rank macaw has very few differences, aside from attack patterns and speed. He tends to double up his volley much more often, but that's about it. Generations Ultimate actually brought back the Gaiadrome of all monsters. He's been updated in the same way the other raptors were in 4 Ultimate, with a rage, exhaust and limping state. His snowballs can linger on the ground as brief puddles. Monster Hunter Rise introduces the Great Izuchi, a bird wyvern with a blade for a tail. While he can bite, swipe or spit projectiles, most of his attacks involve his tail, swinging it around, performing a front flip so it embeds in the ground, swinging it around so it embeds in the ground, and this special attack, where he backs up and swings several times. He can also jump on walls and swing his tail on the way down. Great Izuchi's main gimmick is that he is accompanied by 2 smaller Izuchis who he coordinates into performing synced attacks, allowing them to combo into and from each other. The drone raptors were last in generations, but Rise actually brings back 2 of the dog wyverns from the 3rd generation. Great Baggy can now perform this new bite attack and a leaping kick, which he likes to use when a hunter falls asleep. His sleep projectiles are also much larger and linger on the ground. Roggy's poison clouds tend to move faster, and he favours his hip check much more. The 3 are also in Sunbreak, although they have very few differences aside from attack speed and combo abilities. Baggy once again has the ability to jump back and fire a sleep shot. Surprisingly enough, the Velociprey make a return, although like with the Great Jaggy, their adult form is not present. Because we are dealing with 9 different bird wyverns, I decided to make a tier list to show how I feel about each of them and who is the best. In the bottom tiers we have the original raptors, the dromes. Their fight is basic even for tutorial monsters. That being said, their method of attacking, which is just to strike in front of them, is good for teaching players about basic movement, and that dodging to the side of attacks is often a good strategy. Velocidrome and Iodrome are C tier because one is the original and the other's projectile make him a decent step above. Gendrome is kind of where his paralysis just makes him a mildly upgraded Velocidrome. Gaiadrome's existence is very easy to forget about, and I find it very funny how they included him in Generations Ultimate. He really is just a reskinned Velocidrome with no other physical differences. The snowman status is kind of irrelevant and forgettable too. In B tier, we have the Great Baggy and Roggy. The Jaggy is above, so I will discuss them all together. The dog wyverns are a massive step up from the drone raptors because their attacks actually hit from different angles, which makes them trickier to deal with, and teaches players more about the game. One of my favourite things is that a lot of their attacks have similar animations to Deviljho, so in a way, they're indirectly preparing players for a future encounter with him. I find Great Jaggy to be better than the other 2 because the status attacks are usually easy to dodge and tend to prolong the fight a bit. Jaggy being an up-close fighter makes things much more fun. I dislike Sunbreak's iteration of the Roggy because it tends to spam his hip check a lot, while the Baggy is more diverse with its moveset, which makes him better, but not as good as the Jaggy. Izuchi is just below Jaggy. I find him to be a fantastic tutorial monster, with clearly telegraphed but hard-hitting attacks. That being said, I'm very disappointed by his gimmick. The smaller Izuchis could have been a real threat to the hunter and really set him apart, but the problem is that they get caught in the crossfire a lot and die too easily, so you often forget they're even there. I think it would have been better if they were a special type that had more health and were bigger and hit harder, or they were immortal until Izuchi dies. The Great Macaw is S tier. I think he's the best raptor bird wyvern they've ever made. He's definitely one of the most unique with his rapid attacks and tricks, and arguably he's the hardest of them all. But he teaches players about timing their dodges and attacks, and there are clear counters to him. He's a lot of fun, and I would love for him to make a return someday. Which bird wyvern is your favourite? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you want to support me, feel free to donate to my Patreon, where you get to be credited in the video and see early videos ahead of everyone else.